The Prix Galien is a welcome initiative to stimulate creative research and promote excellence. Barack Obama. The Galien Awards ceremony is considered the equivalent of the Oscars night for the innovators in the labs and awards every year the best pharmaceutical product, the best biotechnology product, the best medical technology, best digital health, best incubator accelerator, best startup.
This is the right event, on the right issue, at the right time.
I thank His Excellency, the President, for bringing Prix Galien to Africa, and I look forward to the day when we will celebrate an African winner of the Prix Galien.
I'm particularly grateful to receive this award.
The awards are among the highest honors in science and commerce because they lead to improvement in the human condition.
The Prix Galien Awards recognize the world's brightest minds and most innovative companies. They are a true celebration of the hard work required to produce life-changing interventions.
That is what makes us optimistic about the future.
Congratulations to all of you.
Make a difference. Join the Galien Foundation.
Welcome to the Galien Foundation Week of Innovation webinars in New York. My name is Alexandra Moons and I'm Director of Product Marketing at H1 and the moderator for today's session. The objective of this week is to provide additional content and background for our largest annual event, the Prix Galien USA Awards, to be held this Thursday in New York in conjunction with our annual Galien Forum of speakers representing top scientific experts and leaders in global health. Because the mission of Galien is innovating to improve the human condition, we have developed this new webinar series to give our nominees for Best Pharmaceutical, Best Biotech, Best MedTech, Best Digital Solution, and Best Startup Accelerator Incubator categories greater visibility in describing their journey of medical discovery. This year's Galien USA Awards has a record of 147 nominees for our 6 categories from 126 companies, covering 15 therapeutic areas ranging from cancer, cardiology, neuroscience to infectious diseases, and very rare genetic disorders all the way to vaccines. We will be looking closely at the products in all of these critical areas throughout the week. In the Best Biotechnology category, which is our focus for today, we will be holding 3 webinars due to the large number of products representing this important field. The webinar is devoted to nominees in chronic autoimmune disorders and vaccines. What we will cover today relates to the central question: will clinical progress in therapies that promise a genetic-based cure for devastating rare diseases lead to similar innovations in patient access to these high-cost and high-touch treatments? Note that this webinar includes some time for audience questions as well. So if you have any questions, please forward them to myself, the moderator, using the link provided on your screen. Now, let me get started by introducing our amazing panel of nominee representatives today. So I'm going to start with Dr. Ulrike Buchwald. She is the Executive Director of Global Clinical Development and Vaccines at Merck, and she's representing the Vaxneuvance products. I also have with me David Anderson, who is the Chief Scientific Officer at VBI Vaccines, who is representing the Pre-Hevbrio products. Then I also have Jaya Tiwari, who is the VP of Clinical and Regulatory Affairs US for ex vivo perfusion with the XPS with STEEN solution. And last but absolutely not least is Dr. Teresa Podrebarek, who is the Senior VP Clinical Development at Horizon Therapeutics, representing the Tepezza products. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me on this panel. Now, to really kick us off, I would love to just get started by asking you all to tell us a little bit about why did your company choose to focus on the disease state and indication associated with this product? In what ways did the product represent a therapeutic breakthrough, and how significant was that level of unmet medical need before? So just to kick that off, Ulrike, would you mind just starting with that?
Certainly, and thank you foremost, Alejandra, and the Prix Galien organizers for inviting us for this biotech seminar webinar today. It's a great honor for me to represent the Vaxneuvance development team as well as Merck in this conversation that we are having. So Vaxneuvance, let me explain, is a 15-valent pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. Merck has actually been involved in pneumococcal disease prevention for more than 40 years. So we have a long history focusing on this disease burden due to the Streptococcus pneumonia. And pneumococcal disease, let me explain, is caused by Streptococcus pneumonia or the pneumococcus. And there are many different serotypes of Streptococcus pneumonia that can cause disease, but the majority of disease is caused by only a few select ones. We have seen over the last couple of years a tremendous impact of pneumococcal vaccines on the disease in adult as well as pediatric populations, but there is a significant disease burden that remains. And that could be, for example, invasive pneumococcal disease as well as non-invasive pneumococcal disease, such as acute otitis media or pneumonia. So Merck set out to develop Vaxneuvance to address the unmet medical need that remains in the field, and wanted to develop a single formulation for both adult and pediatric populations to address disease burden by novel serotypes that are not covered in currently available vaccines, such as, for example, PCV13, as well as maintain or improve immunogenicity against serotypes that are covered in vaccines, but that are still causing disease within both adult and pediatric populations. So Vaxneuvance is now a novel pneumococcal vaccine that is approved in the United States for individuals 6 weeks of age and older for the prevention of invasive disease. And it maintains strong immune responses to all serotypes included in the available PCVs, as well as expand coverage to serotypes 22F and 33F, which are highly invasive serotypes that are associated with antimicrobial resistance. It also improves the immunogenicity against serotype 3 pneumococcus, which is a very prevalent serotype despite being included in previous vaccines. And while we don't fully understand whether immunogenicity will translate into better protection, we are optimistic that we have seen the increased immunogenicity against this serotype across different populations. And within the pediatric population, especially, Vaxneuvance has been now the first new and higher valent pneumococcal vaccine that has been licensed in more than a decade in the United States. So that is a true innovation and a breakthrough in expanding coverage as well as addressing the residual burden of disease in this field.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. Maybe just as a quick follow-up, you mentioned that it has already been approved in the United States. Is there also plans to approve this in other regions of the world, Europe, or maybe the Asia-Pacific regions? Or is that just not the same type of patient population that you would be targeting there?
No, this vaccine is intended for populations across the globe. And we have approval for both the adult and now also the pediatric indication as well in the EU. And also we have global filings underway. We are approved also in Canada, for example. So this is a global product, and hopefully it will improve health not only in the United States, but also in other countries and continents.
Fantastic, thank you. No, this is amazing. As maybe our audience has seen or will be seeing during the presentation of each of our panelists, we will also be posting a link to a short explanation that the company has provided on the products themselves in case anyone is interested in learning a little bit more. But with that being said, David, would you mind just giving your thoughts on where your product sits, where your vaccine sits, the unmet clinical or medical need that it was really trying to solve?
Yeah, happy to do so. And let me begin by thanking you and the organizers. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. So we certainly believe that hepatitis B is a very significant, underappreciated medical need, both globally and within the United States. If you look worldwide, there are 300 million chronically infected individuals with hepatitis B. If you look within the US, it's just over 2 million, with about 1 million HBV-associated deaths every year. Now, fortunately, since the late 80s or early 90s, there have been single antigen hepatitis B vaccines that have been available. They're incredibly effective in newborns and in the adolescent population. So in fact, just about every child born in the United States gets a birth dose before they're even allowed to leave the hospital. And I said they're very effective. The challenge, though, is that in older adults, particularly above age 45, the current conventional single antigen vaccines become much less effective. And that's amplified if you look at certain adults with comorbidities, whether it be diabetes or obesity, smoking, excessive drinking. So there's a challenge there. Moreover, if you look at those infected in the US, over 70% are unaware that they're infected. And this is a virus that's 100 times more infectious than HIV. So it creates a real problem. Now, fortunately, our product, PreHevbrio, is differentiated from these conventional single antigen vaccines in the sense that it expresses all three surface antigens from the hepatitis B virus. And it's going to sound obvious to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. The more closely a vaccine mimics the virus it's targeting, it stands to reason that the more efficacious it's going to be. And so we know from published studies from other investigators that the conformation is influenced whether you have three antigens like we have in PreHevbrio or just one antigen. We also manufacture the vaccine differently for the traditional vaccine. So we have mammalian glycosylation rather than yeast glycosylation. And glycosylation certainly can influence the immunogenicity. And then finally, we know that these additional antigens have what are called T helper epitopes that can help really drive protective antibody responses. So it's a variety of different aspects that are differentiated that led us to believe that PreHevbrio could really address the shortcomings in terms of responsiveness to the traditional vaccines in the adult population.
No, that's extremely fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. Do you see any immediate expansions of potential other solutions or other therapeutic areas where you would feel like the similar approach of mimicking the virus as closely as possible is going to be something that you guys would also be moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned at the onset that there are 300 million individuals chronically infected. So here you're not trying to prevent infection, you're trying to treat infection. I think these additional antigens present uniquely in PreHevbrio would be particularly useful in a therapeutic formulation. So in fact, we've actually taken the basis of PreHevbrio, we've reformulated it, and are in the midst of phase 2 studies to try to treat individuals chronically infected with hepatitis B. Otherwise, they're on lifelong drug therapy. So that's certainly a new indication. I think there's a lot of excitement that the therapeutic hepatitis B field is where the hepatitis C field was a decade or so ago.
No, that's great intel. Thank you so much. Jaya, from your perspective, of course, you are looking at this a little bit from a different angle. How would you describe the unmet clinical need or the unmet medical need that you were taking a stab at with your XPS steam solution?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I'd like to thank the foundation and you, Alexandra, for being a great moderator. We feel very honored to be a part of this. when it comes to end-stage organ failure, at some point, your options for therapeutics just run out, and there's nothing left down that road aside from an organ transplant. And unfortunately, in the United States, it's estimated about 33 patients die every day waiting for an organ. So there is a desperate need to address the organ shortage. Now, our organs come from brain dead donors, and that is not the ideal scenario for the health of an organ. So generally, one of the biggest things that happens is neurogenic pulmonary edema that can start up from the inflammatory cascade that is induced with brain death. So one of the most vulnerable organs in that situation are the lungs. And it is estimated that approximately 80 to 85% of all lungs are turned down. So they are not even meeting the quality of being able to be transplanted into a recipient. So we really saw an opportunity for helping patients to get a better access to a transplant and hopefully try to reduce the waitlist mortality, or in other words, how many patients die waiting for an organ. The STEAM solution is actually the focus of this product. It is a extracellular solution that contains human serum albumin and dextran 40. And it was developed to actually maintain organs outside of the body at normothermia, or at body temperature, for an extended period of time to allow for a further evaluation of the organ. So the XPS system was developed as a mechanism of perfusing that solution through the lungs once they're procured from a donor, and providing clinicians an opportunity to really evaluate and assess if those organs are safe to be transplanted into a recipient. When it came to approaching this as a therapeutic breakthrough, it was a bit difficult because it is a combination product. So it does involve a solution as well as a device that has a heater cooler, a Mackay pump, a ventilator. And so it's a very complicated system, but an incredible tool for the clinicians to be able to hopefully make more organs available for transplant.
Amazing. Wow. Maybe just as a short follow-up question, I'm sure this is something that's come up a lot of times for you guys, is with recently the whole COVID situation that we are still a little bit getting out of, and the impact that COVID has had on the lungs, has that been something that has driven the company and the product forward, or has that really been seen as more of a, something that's holding you guys back because of so many patients actually suffering from those lungs that have been affected due to COVID infections or stuff like that?
No, that's a great question. We were pleasantly surprised to see how many lung transplant clinics maintained their lung transplant volume quickly after the COVID pandemic, and then immediately started realizing the need for transplanting COVID recipients who had irreparable lung damage from it. I think our product while not uniquely tailored for the COVID, pandemic, it allowed physicians an additional layer of safety when they're going out to procure organs, knowing that they don't have to make that decision to turn the organ down in a cramped environment with the time, the clock ticking at the procurement hospital, but rather could bring the organ back to their hospital and evaluate it in a more controlled manner.
That's amazing. Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that view. Teresa, would you also be interested in sharing a little bit your view on where the TEPEZZA product really came in from a therapeutic perspective, and as well with that unmet medical need that we were trying to solve there? Yeah.
Thank you, Alejandra, and again to the Prix Galien, for recognizing our contributions. And I'd like to start off by stating that there was a bit of serendipity involved in how TEPEZZA came to be. And the reason I say that is that it's really a story of following the science. And the pathway for TEPEZZA is it's an antibody that blocks IGF-1R, or insulin-like growth factor receptor. And this receptor had been studied by multiple companies, for example, to treat cancers. and to treat oncology. And yet over the years, it was not as favorable as they anticipated in terms of treating some of these cancers. But this is the interesting part where, and I'm not sure who exactly to attribute it to, but had been doing some work looking at, the receptors involved in the extraocular muscles in patients who had an overactive thyroid, or what we generally call with thyroid eye disease. And they found strikingly that not only is it the thyroid, the TSH receptor, or thyroid stimulating hormone receptor, that the receptors on these muscles, but also the IGF-1R. And that even patients who, for example, have had complete radioactive ablation, which is we use radioactive iodine to ablate the gland for those that have, hyperactive thyroid, is that patients still had certain symptoms. And one of the ones that, is more common in how we recognize of these symptoms is the thyroid eye disease. And that's recognized by this eye bulging, which we call proptosis. And again, it was this discovery that there are receptors here for this particular pathway, which now I'm in darkness, but let me see if I can turn the light on. 1 second, hold on. Perhaps that was a clue that I was talking too much. I'm not sure when the lights went up. But as we have it, so there was this understanding that these receptors were present on these extraocular muscles. And again, our company has really specialized in rare disease. And some of our individuals saw these early data in this experimental form, and there was a small study that had been done, a phase 2 study, because again, this condition is uncommon and rare, where they actually gave patients who had thyroid eye disease, or the proptosis, this antibody, and saw some compelling results. Now, at first glance, you might think the unmet need is maybe purely cosmetic, right, that the eyes are bulging. But when you actually speak to patients, they really had very few options. Not only did they have the eye bulging, but it can be associated with significant inflammation. So redness of the eyes, a grittiness sensation, inflammation of the eyelids, double vision, because the extraocular muscles are so enlarged, that they hypertrophy because of the stimulation of these autoantibodies that are stimulating these, or the antibodies stimulating the tissue, that the eye muscles cannot track properly, right? And so there was this underappreciation of, the magnitude of effects that patients were experiencing. And just to give you a sense, there had been no medicinal products used to treat this other than perhaps steroids, which we often use in the setting of inflammation. And so these patients were often seen by their endocrinologist, and then maybe referred to an ophthalmologist. And eventually some of them, for their symptoms, would see an oculoplastic surgeon or a strabismus surgeon to have surgery to try and release those extraocular muscles, and perhaps even reshape the eyelids, to give the patients relief. And when you think about it, to have, let's say, double vision, such that if you're trying to work on a computer screen, or you're trying to drive, and everything is uncertain because you're seeing the images are vibrating, almost, and really to have no voice, that these patients, really had no therapeutic options. So along came this study, and our company saw the data, and we said, well, it wasn't that we said, oh, gee, we are out looking for therapies for thyroid eye disease. This is more of a story of following the science and just saying, we see an opportunity where this medication maybe didn't work as intended in cancer patients, but here's an opportunity to help these patients who really have had no voice. And the surgeries can actually be quite significant, where they have to actually go into the orbit, reshape the orbit, work with the extraocular muscles. So we were able to then become the first approved product to treat patients with thyroid eye disease with Tepezza. And now we hear testimonials, from patients who, had been told maybe, well, you just need to learn to live with it, because over time, perhaps that acute inflammation subsides, but they're often still left with the eye bulging, sometimes the double vision and that. So I think for those patients who had really had an unrecognized or unappreciated level of perhaps disability, discomfort, and even your self-esteem, that it's not simply cosmetic, but it really impacts your everyday life. And I think that was the connecting the dots, so to speak, of repurposing a medication and following the science. And that's what led us to the discovery and eventual approval of Tepezza.
I love the fact that you called it a little bit the serendipity story there as well. I think in a lot of cases, especially when it comes to medicine, there's, a primary use case, and then it turns out in certain areas that the secondary use case is actually just much more or much better and much more suited. Is there, as a follow-up there, is there any idea so far whether there would be additional applications potentially moving forward in the future for the Tepezza products? And is that something that you guys are actively evaluating?
There is. We have focused quite a bit right now on, the different eye manifestations, and what we're hearing from, the clinicians, and many of them are surgeons who now say, I sometimes don't even need to do surgery any longer, or it can be a much less invasive surgery for the patient. But what we're hearing are, in different cases where they're exploring the use. And I think one of the things that, I heard recently is that there's a condition called compressive optic neuropathy. And what that means is that the fatty tissue, in addition to the extraocular muscles, are so enlarged or inflamed that they're actually compressing the optic nerve and are visual threatening. So the patients are in danger of losing their vision. Right. And so rather than going for acute surgery, they're using Tepezza and being able to use a medical intervention and not necessarily going into surgery. And again, these are still rare, but for a patient faced with visual loss, I think that you would have a medical option, I think is something, worth pursuing. We're also considering some other enhancements, to Tepezza in terms of how do we, it's currently an infusion, but how do we make it more friendly for patients in terms of a subcutaneous administration. And, we have some other things also that we're working on in discovery, but also trying to understand whether the pathway that we found in this particular set of the orbit could be translated into some other diseases as well, where there's an inflammatory and a fibrotic potential, looking in different tissues. So that's something that we're still exploring experimentally.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think there's a lot of great things coming your way in that case. Now, just to kick our discussion off a little bit, and I'd love to have everyone just join in on this as we're going, but with everyone here on this panel being, scientists, clinicians, at least people who are aware of how science works, I would love to hear from everyone a little bit. Where do you see the next wave of innovations going? Like, if we would have to look into maybe 5 to 10 years from now, where do you see or would hope to see your field of excellence really have moved towards? Any key topics or any key challenges that you would like to highlight from that perspective? And maybe, Ulrika, I'll start with you again, and everyone can just join in.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Alexandra. And also thank you to the other panelists. I really enjoyed learning so much, and it's really fascinating to hear the stories of the development. So I think for pneumococcal disease, there are some challenges going forward. And, we have been very successful with these multivalent vaccines, but we also know that there might be limitations in terms of adding, certain serotypes. And as I mentioned before, there are around 100 serotypes, and sometimes they can switch, depending on what other of their, cousins are around, or, are kind of prevented by disease. Other serotypes can come up. And these vaccines are very complex vaccines. They're very complex to manufacture. We always say, for example, Vaxneuvance is in a way 15 different vaccines in one, because it addresses 15 different serotypes. So there are challenges, addressing the burden of disease that we have now, but also anticipating what the burden of disease is in the future, for example, and how the bacterium may evolve, in adaptation to the vaccines that we are using. So Merck currently takes a strategy that is a little bit novel, or is novel in that field, in that we are looking at how we can leverage vaccination in different populations. For example, in the infant populations, typically there's a solid immunization program in many countries, including in the United States, where infants receive 3 doses in the first year of life and then 1 dose in the second year of life. And that use of vaccine in this population also protects adults. But we have also seen that then adults are more susceptible to other pneumococcal infections or other serotypes, because they have underlying medical diseases that make them very susceptible. For example, immunosuppression or organ transplant that we heard about. So we currently have a vaccine in clinical development, in phase 3 clinical development, actually, that's called V116, and that will be a pneumococcal conjugate vaccine that is specifically designed for the adult population in those countries that also have protection through the infant immunization programs. And that is one way for us where we hope that we can maximize the public health impact, yet kind of address this complex manufacturing, and also the concern that increasing serotypes may be associated with the loss of overall immunogenicity. So we think about the manufacturing as a kind of multidimensional aspect, where we have to keep good immunogenicity, but also increase the coverage and the cases that we would potentially avert. I also think that looking further ahead, maybe into the next decade, I see challenges in the field that, for example, what also Dr. Anderson had told us about the hepatitis B field, right? That there are some of the, especially adults, that are somehow not appropriate or not perfectly responding to vaccines because they have underlying conditions, or they have immunosuppressive medications. And I think there is still work to do there in the future, also to optimize protection for those populations, as well as for those people that unfortunately, for example, still suffer from a pneumococcal infection, to reduce some of the sequelae that they may have. We have learned, over the last couple of years that, for example, many adults who may come down with pneumonia, that they may develop a cardiac condition, or they may have a heart attack, around the time of hospitalization or later on. And there might be other ways that we have to look into, addressing those kind of sequelae of invasive or pulmonary infections, for example, especially in adults. So there is remains a lot to do. I think we have a very kind of innovative approach, and obviously we are excited to continue to learn more and follow the science and see how we can improve population health.
Amazing, David. Please share.
Yeah, if I could add, I think it's worth pointing out that if you think about the scientific disciplines, immunology generally is a very young discipline compared to physics, biochemistry, cell biology. And I really think that we're in a golden age of immunology, which translates into our understanding of vaccine development and vaccinology. If you think about a CNS autoimmune disease called multiple sclerosis, over the past couple decades, clinical practice has fundamentally transformed based on antibodies targeting different molecules, whether it be T cell infiltration of the CNS or B cells. If you think about cancer, it's fundamentally transformed with the checkpoint inhibitors. And so I think that's also now translating into our thoughts about vaccines. I think everyone initially thinks, well, they're to prevent infection, they're prophylactic. I think in the years to come, we really will have therapeutic vaccines where you can teach the immune system through vaccines and potentially other modalities to really seek out and help clear, what would otherwise be chronic viral infections. So I think that's something very exciting to look forward to in the years to come.
I was just going to echo a little bit what David said about, the infancy of immunology. I remember when I trained as a rheumatologist, I said, maybe I should learn some immunology because I think I'd be a better rheumatologist. And again, this, predates, well, I think of modern immunology as really with HIV, how that really fundamentally changed how we thought about immunology in general. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about related to your question is, we work in a lot of chronic autoimmune diseases, and that's a place where you don't necessarily have these monogenic diseases, right? In the chronic autoimmunity, usually there's a combination of genetics and epigenetics and all of these different factors. But one of the things I've been more intrigued about in terms of a combination of technologies is thinking about perhaps a local gene therapy that can deliver a certain protein or even an antibody that can be efficacious. And so, for example, having had some experience working with and not necessarily having to use viral vectors either in terms of getting your protein to express. But let's say you had a lung condition. Is there something that you could have that's inhaled that will actually transfect, the epithelial cells, for example, if that's what you wanted to produce a certain cytokine, a regulatory cytokine, or that you could give certain things more locally. So using a combination of what we know from gene technology and a little bit of immunology or vaccine approaches, and trying to get cells to express things to heal in a certain area, and maybe starting more localized. So for many of our diseases, there are local symptoms, or they can also be used to treat cancers. And one example that I had worked on was, thinking about, can we get some of the checkpoint inhibitors, for example, to express in the bladder, right? So we know that there's tumors of the bladder, which now it's not autoimmunity, but, in oncology, because we're tied at the hip, and be able to express locally when the tumors are still, let's say, confined more to, we call it non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. So rather than giving a systemic checkpoint inhibitor, which we know has really revolutionized, right, how we think about oncology, and now all the different places where all the different nodes we can intersect, but again, it also comes with some adverse effects, right? So some patients are unable to carry on with their checkpoint inhibitors because they get, bad diarrhea or colitis. They can get skin inflammation. They can get pituitary dysfunction and that. So if you can localize that and have even antibodies expressed locally, or single arm, or other things, I think that could be a combination of techniques that could help us address, I think, some serious health conditions in the future.
Yeah, I want to build off what you said, Teresa. You get me very excited when you're talking about inhaled therapeutics, and right. This is exactly what we have already seen some of our clinicians and investigators working on. So, with lungs that are damaged, there's only so much you can do within 6 hours to assess if that organ. You can reverse pulmonary edema. You can maybe ventilate some. Collapsed air spaces. But when it comes to other things, you need an extended period of time. And ideally, you need to keep that organ viable, maybe 24, 48 hours, in order to see if delivery of any kind of genetic or inhaled gases, anything like that, can have a therapeutic effect. So that, for us, I think, is the next big thing. At the core of organ transplant is absolutely immunology, right? One of the biggest causes of mortality in the first 72 hours is organ rejection for lungs. These patients sign up for a lifetime of immunosuppression. And we're constantly looking to see, is there something that can be done in that pre-surgical phase, or even, for example, on a platform like the XPS that you can prime that organ? Is there something we can do to reduce that graft dysfunction effect that puts patients at such a high risk? So there's that part of it, and then there's the part of, can we reverse lung injury? Are there models that we can, look at fibrotic lungs and see if there's something we can do? So absolutely, I would echo all of the panelists here. This is a huge source, I think, of innovation in the next several years.
Amazing. Thank you so much all for sharing that view. I think there's definitely a lot of things that, we'll hopefully be seeing in the next couple of years, and also just some general topics that I hear just being re-advocated time over and over again. And actually one of those topics that I heard in each of your explanations, but in a very different way, was a little bit the topic of health equity and how that is really starting to play a bigger piece into this whole industry. We don't even have to look back very far. If we just look at, the COVID situation and the COVID vaccination, where there was a lot of discrepancy between who actually trusted the vaccine and who was able to get the vaccine initially and things like that. I was just wondering if you could all just share a little bit your view on how health equity is going to start, or hopefully start to play a bigger point of focus in your focus area specifically. I'd love to hear some input on that as well. And Ulrike, I'll start with you again, just to get our circle around.
You go first. Yeah, I think it's a very, very important question. And I think especially, for when you think about vaccines, you think about public health and the overall impact, right? And equity, I think, is one of the main consideration, and also, the desires that we have, right, to increase equity. There are obviously many aspects of ensuring health equity that are more based on implementation, right? That are based on reimbursement system, on access, and those ones, obviously, we as a pharmaceutical company, we also work closely with other stakeholders in the field, and try to support these aspects. What you mentioned, the communication, the science communication that can address and also overcome equity issues. I think we have learned, as you point out, very much over the last couple of years how important that is, right? How important it is also to understand where, for example, in the field of vaccines, where there's vaccines hesitancy, and understand the reasons behind that, and understand why people think the way they think. And certainly, we also have efforts within the company to understand those reasons, as well as to help to mitigate them or address them. But I also think on the product development side, equity can also be supported by looking, for example, at the disease burden in particular populations, right? And that is something where we can take into account early in the development era, at the discovery level, or at the early development, to see, for example, where's the burden of disease, right? And is the burden of disease now in my field, right, of certain serotypes or certain manifestations of pneumococcal disease, how does it play out in different populations, right? So we can also take that into account, what is at the core of our, of what we do on a day-to-day basis, the development. And I think that is important, also to understand the differential burden of disease in different populations, and take that into account early on in development.
Absolutely, thank you. David, I see you coming on.
Yes. I mean, it's obvious to say that, prevention is better than a cure. So vaccines, by their very nature, address that issue of health equity. I think, you've also touched upon the fact that, especially coming out of starting to come out of the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of increased vaccine hesitancy. And maybe some groups didn't feel that they had access to it just because there were some new vaccine modalities. And while they've been shown to be, safe and incredibly effective in literally billions of people, there isn't long-term safety data. And you just have to recognize that. That's a question that comes up in some people's minds. I think this is certainly one point of differentiation from, our approach to PreHevbrio and our other vaccine modalities and candidates. We're using an adjuvant, which has literally been in hundreds of millions of individuals, including babies, for 4 or 5 decades. So we do know that there's a long-term history of safety. And I think that's really, really important. We need to recognize and remind ourselves all the time, and I know everyone on this panel does so, we adhere to the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. In the case of prophylactic vaccines, you're giving something to someone who's healthy, and you got to make sure that, you're not compromising that in any way. And so I think the choice of vaccine modalities, depending on the vaccine, the disease burden, I think these are all important considerations when it comes time to deciding what is that candidate really going to look like.
I absolutely echo these sentiments. And I think in when we look at organ transplant, I might be able to give a unique view on it, because the health equity, it comes into play with both the recipients, so the patients who are in need of an organ, but also all of us who are potentially organ donors. And I think that the big, I've had the luck of working in the hospital side with these patients before coming on to work in the medical device industry. And I think it's upon us to break that information down. So all of the things that David just mentioned about the long record of safety and the rigorous testing that these go through, we know what we do with the FDA, we know what we do with our regulatory authorities, and it's such a highly technical and burdensome process that we are uniquely tailored to do. But for the population out there, I think we have to do a little bit more about making that information available in an easy way to them, because I think we can talk from high up and say, hey, this has a 5-year safety data, this has gone through this level of efficacy testing, but then breaking that information down into pieces that I think resonates with all populations is really a big responsibility that we all have.
So I was going to take the conversation in a slightly different tangent, let's just say, from health equity and talk a little bit about diversity. And I think, for example, with some of the vaccines we've talked about, but medicine at large, is that do we do a good enough job of demonstrating how the data relates to the individual, right? And so I'm thinking about different populations that, let's say, disproportionately affect certain minority groups, whether they're African Americans or of Hispanic origin or different origins. And, now there's a mandate coming from FDA and, an internal mandate to say that if a disease, disproportionately affects these groups, let's make sure we study them and have the data to share with stakeholders to say, who in your study looks like me, or who in your study has the same concerns that I have, because of, let's say, certain genetic predispositions, or, we know that several of them, not only are they disproportionately affected, there's a higher incidence, but they have a more severe form of the disease, right? And I think that, when I think back of the COVID pandemic and all the different, subtypes and thinking about individuals, well, did we do a good enough job of saying, well, patients who, let's say, were over a certain age or over a certain body weight or with certain comorbidities, how well did they do, with vaccines or with data? Because then they're saying, and it gave others perhaps a reason to say, well, I don't need the vaccine because I'm not in that group or what have you. So I would share that in order to have equity, I think we need to also embrace diversity and do a better job of having the science more approachable, I think, for patients and payers and others, so that they can, help identify with us and have the data that supports that. And maybe that's a lofty goal, but so is health equity. It's a very, I think, complicated deliverable, but I'm sure all of us here, we develop these things, so that the greatest number of people can benefit, not just those that can get access or pay for it around the world. And how we do that better as a society, I think, is it's a complicated question. So,
yeah, if I could just build on that, I mean, we absolutely agree. And built into one of our large pivotal studies, subgroup analysis, looking at individuals that we knew from past studies didn't typically respond as well. So whether they were overweight or they were smokers or drinkers, diabetic. And relative to the conventional single antigen vaccine, what we saw was typically about a 15% increase in the seroprotection rate. Now, you can ask yourself, 15%, okay, there's a difference, but what does that really mean? Well, if you think about it, 1 out of every 6 people coming into a doctor's office with the traditional vaccine wasn't protected, and they thought they were going to be protected, whereas they would be protected with ours. So a 15% difference matters, and it matters to those subgroups, those individuals that the field knows generally often don't respond as well. So I think it's absolutely critical to build that into future studies.
Maybe one thought here also that, we've heard about precision medicine, right? Recently also, I think it comes more up in the vaccine field, precision vaccines, precision vaccinology. And that also actually goes back to what we discussed before, how much more we're beginning to understand about the immunology, right? Understanding what are those factors that affect immune responses in different populations, and that could be infants versus toddlers or older children. It could be older adults, for example. It could be specific, populations based on medical history or treatment. And I think, this kind of advent of a better and much improved immunologic understanding and how we can also overcome certain, I don't want to say defects, but certain predispositions to those susceptibility to infections can also be a way to address equity and this kind of differential burden of disease in different populations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I can only share all the sentiments that have been shared so far from this panel. That awareness across the patient population is absolutely going to be critical, and also being very well aware of all of the disease burden within those different groups, and how that's going to take a big impact into how we're starting and really taking it all the way through the finish line. I know we have only a couple of minutes left. I'm quickly taking a pause to look at if there are any questions from the audience. So far, I don't see any. So what I would like to then end with is just if you could, go back 5 years in time and you could give yourself a piece of advice. Doesn't have to be long, just in a short thing. What kind of advice, knowing what you know today, what type of advice would you give yourself related to your product in taking that forward? And Ulrike, I'll start with you again, and then we'll just turn around.
Yeah, I think for us, it may have been, that we probably wished we would have been faster, but that's obviously a very general statement in this industry. But, just one learning that we had at some point relates actually to a lot what we discussed, that we found good results early on in adults and toddlers, but then we didn't see the same good results in infants. So we had to go back and understand the science. What Teresa said before, we had to follow the science, and it did add a couple of years to the development. But eventually, I think it was actually good, because it is important that we have the best understanding of, the mechanism of actions of these vaccines, and that we get the best products. And I think we achieved that. Obviously, if it would have been faster, it would have been even better.
Of course, yes. Thank you. David.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo that. I mean, if you think about Prehevbrio, it was licensed in Israel back in 1990. The first clinical trials were in 1989, and there have been 20 plus trials that have been run. It takes a long time to develop a vaccine. Again, given the fact that you need to make sure first and foremost it's incredibly safe. I think we ran our pivotal study in North America and Europe in 2017, and what I would have told myself is just be persistent and recognize that it's going to take longer than you think, and it's going to be harder than you think. But in the end, it's going to be entirely worth it for the patients that are seeing the benefits. So that's certainly something that we've learned. It will almost always take longer than you think it is, and take more work, but it ends up being worth it.
That's great advice. Thank you. Gia.
No, I'm laughing when David's talking about the timelines, because we also started our clinical trial in 2011, but the discussions with the FDA started in 2008. And for a frame of reference, steam solution has been used around the world starting in 2001. So Toronto was doing transplants with this. And our trial finished in 2018, getting an approval in 2019, right? So if I could go back and give myself some advice, or our team advice, I think that we may have engaged our regulatory bodies a little earlier, and may have tried to come up with a creative way, because when you have a rare disease space, you have something that's only affecting a small population that meets your inclusion-exclusion criteria, but you have this high bar for a safety and efficacy trial. You have to come up with a creative way to make that product, to get it through to approval and actually be able to benefit the recipients. So we tried the humanitarian device exemption pathway, and I'm not sure that was the right pathway when you want to have that sort of high fidelity. We probably should have gone for that in the beginning. I think we came out stronger for it, but it is something, I think, to abbreviate that timeline and make that product available. I think it's definitely something we wish we would have known.
Absolutely. Teresa, what about you?
I think, reflecting for Tepezza, at the time I mentioned how the first studies, to help the product for approval focused really much more on acute disease. And there was a sense from some of the early understanding that that's where the greatest need was in those individuals in the first, let's say, up to 3 years, who had the inflammatory symptoms as well. I mentioned the redness of the eyes, the grittiness, the inflammation of the eyelids, the double vision, and that I think if with the benefit of looking back in time, had we appreciated maybe the full spectrum of the disease. And so we've just completed a study now, and we're waiting for the data of looking at those individuals who maybe have less inflammation, but are still having the bulging and the double vision that are beyond 3 years. And I think had we at that time maybe done a more comprehensive understanding of it's really a spectrum. It's not that all of a sudden the disease ends at a certain place, but that patients it changes over time, and that surgery was still being done. And we've had patients now who have had thyroid eye disease for 20 years and are responding, for their symptoms with Tepezza. And I think that was totally unexpected, that we would be able to impact the disease along a spectrum. And again, it just goes to, that quite often with some of these rare diseases, we don't always have the best natural history data, for us to really understand the course, the progression, and if there's, reversals of certain things. So I think going back, had we had a better, maybe a fuller understanding of that natural history, we could have made some different choices or decisions to help even more patients with the medication, which we're hoping to do now.
Yeah, I think obviously that would be amazing to have had in the past. With that, our time is up. So I would like to thank my amazing panel here for the great discussion. I've learned a lot based on what I've heard. I think everyone here has learned a lot. So just as a small reminder, this webinar is also available on the Galien Foundation homepage. And we do also have the Jubilee Forum agenda on Thursday starting at 7:30 a.m. Eastern. At 6:30 p.m. on that same Thursday, we have the 2022 Roy Vagalos Pro Bono Humanum Awards that will be presented immediately followed by the Galien Awards dinner, both of which are going to be held at the American Museum of Natural History. So thank you all so much for joining me here today, and I can only wish you a very pleasant rest of your day.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Alexander.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.